Now, with Revenge of the Sith, I didn't really have that many changes that I wanted to make, so I thought I could just quickly make a little video. You know, comparatively to Attack of the Clones, it's got like, I don't know, a sixth of the changes, so I thought I could do that in a third of the time easily. Now, obviously that went horribly wrong. My first draft of it was over an hour long, so I ended up breaking it out into 3 separate videos. What I'm going to do here is take those 3 separate videos and recombine them back into the order of that first draft. It's maybe in some ways going to be a little all over the place, but hopefully in other ways you'll get more out of it than the original videos. There's some nice little pieces that you missed out on, so I'll re-record those and throw those back in. And a lot of the structural stuff didn't quite, you know, come together as clearly as it does in order. So it's going to be a little all over the place, but I think at the same time there'll be a lot more interesting pieces tying it together. And actually the explanation of the structure of Revenge of the Sith was one of the things that sort of got chopped around all over the place. So hopefully having that all kind of explained near the top will inform all of my changes going on. I'm just rambling now, sorry. We'll get to it. Revenge of the Sith is pretty good. It's not bad. It's just okay, actually. So we need to talk about Jar Jar Binks and United States foreign policy. Now, the original trilogy has some very obvious political commentary. I'm not even going to argue that. That's accepted fact. But George says that the prequels are similarly political. But it's like, what? It would be bad if there's a bad guy in charge. You know, that's not like a cutting take. But where the original trilogy was a pretty simple tale of good versus evil, the prequels have been updated to reflect a murkier climate. I imagine it was incredibly disheartening to make a simplistic morality fable only to have all the fans really fall in love with the bad guys. So ultimately, the goal here is to recontextualize the whole thing, to make the Empire uncool and bring a real tragedy to Darth Vader. And the commentary is about the large-scale societal effects that allow the Republic to become an empire, rather than just, you know, some cool bad guys popped up. It's a society that was headed in this direction. And Anakin gets caught up in the middle of that. Yeah, look, I'm sorry. This video is just going to be like this, okay? For like the next 7 minutes, it's just going to be tough going. I'm aware that opening with like a long, hard slog that you'll probably disagree with might lose some of you, but we'll crack on. The big theme of this movie is trust. Everyone needs Anakin's trust, and he doesn't know who to trust. And ultimately, it's his failure to trust that sets him down this path of ultimate greed. So it's a poetic subversion of Return of the Jedi, where Luke has trust in Darth Vader over and over again, even when he's proven wrong every time. And the Jedi really can't help Anakin there because of their complete rejection of attachment, which is a theme explored very explicitly in Empire Strikes Back, where the Jedi are going, no, you mustn't save your friends, you can't be attached to anyone, Darth Vader can't be saved, and Luke rejects all that and ultimately proves them wrong. Yeah, I'm simplifying that a lot, okay? But that's just for time. We don't have time to get into Empire Strikes Back. And don't worry about it, okay? It's fine. There's that George Lucas quote.
It's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Which is often used against him as a criticism that he just recycles ideas. But it's actually really one of his strengths. He's talking about semiotics, reusing symbols in new contexts to create new meanings. The opening of episode 1, we can all agree is rough, but it only fails on the actual literal delivery level. On the top level of ideas and symbols and themes, it's doing a lot and it's doing it well. We open in space with some boring negotiations above a planet. Then the heroes go down to the planet and pick up the movie's protagonist. It's basically the perfect inverse of A New Hope, right? Jar Jar is the twisted Luke Skywalker. I told you this was coming, okay? Look. And Jar Jar is very alien and low class even within his own society. And this is classic setup for a morality tale. Our protagonists are going to go through a clumsy negotiation to treat this character as respectfully as possible, and that will show us the value of acceptance and compassion. The Jedi do not do that. The Jedi are c***s. It's important to the prequels that the Jedi are wrong. They've become corrupted by power. When the Emperor says in this movie,
all who gain power are afraid to lose it, even the Jedi.
nothing that he says in that scene is a lie. You're meant to take that at face value. They've become an arm of a corrupt republic, a republic corrupted by financial interests, massive growing inequalities, and most of all, because there's a bad guy in charge. So the Republic refuses to intervene in this blockade, but they send some of their Jedi, and the Jedi can't intervene either, but they come up with a clever little plan. They'll conscript the locals and get them to fight their war for them. But that comes at a cost. By episode 2, the Jedi are distrustful. Where episode 1 was like a mundane day in the life, the shroud of the dark side has fallen. So they start to dig to uncover the threads of this plot, and they discover a secret army and a Sith Lord embedded in the Senate. But then the Separatists reveal themselves, and they go, oh, there's some bad guys, and go to war. Written and shot before 9/11, by the way. Now, as well as being corrupt on this larger social scale, the Republic and the Jedi personally fail Anakin. It's obviously very important to the story that Anakin goes from being a slave kid to being mentored by the ruler of the galaxy, right? He gets lifted up by the elite to be used by them. By the way, the Jedi don't free all the slaves like protagonists would. They free one of the slaves, like Now, just like with Jar Jar, we've got this hyper-exaggerated class disparity, and it strains all of Anakin's relationships. You know, the Jedi obviously find him quite distasteful and just want him for their prophecy. The Emperor, that one explains itself. And Padmé, he views Padmé as like a god, and she doesn't really know what to do with him. In the scripts even, Padmé had more of a romantic interest in Obi-Wan. Of course, that got cut out of all of the movies, but you can see the remnants of that poking through occasionally. And that hurt Attack of the Clones, but it helps Revenge of the Sith to have Anakin playing the jealous husband. Not jealous of someone else, but jealous of losing her, jealous of the concept of death. And he will do anything, including destroying everything she believes in, to stop that from happening. Now, does any of this come across? No, not really, no. All of these elements were meant to coalesce into Anakin's turn, and they're not even on the audience's radar. I mean, as it was originally shot, Anakin would be genuinely convinced by the Emperor's vision of the future, because of all these elements coming together, that partway into the movie, he would choose to side with them over the Jedi. Now, obviously, no one bought it. No one was aware that these elements were even in there to come together. So Anakin's turn was reworked and reworked until it's really just about not wanting to lose Padmé. Which works, you know, we still get the larger themes of loss and greed and societal collapse, but it's done as a sort of subtle character study. The plotting is more abstract and tonal. Reworking Anakin's arc to be about not losing Padmé means that, you know, his arc now has this ironic Macbeth-like quality, but at the same time a lot of the literal tensions get dropped. For time and pace, we can't explore Padmé joining the rebellion, or the war, or the Jedi losing their way, which is a shame. If we had another movie in the middle to explore those things, that would be great. But ultimately, focusing in on Anakin, making this more of an abstract character piece, the net result is a better movie. On its surface, most of the prequel trilogy is very on the nose. So I can see that when you reach the back half of Revenge of the Sith and it suddenly really puts the opera in space opera, it's a difficult thing to buy into. But if you do, I think it's really great. So that was going to be the opening, and the good thing about having that as the opening is it really informs all of the changes that I'm going to make. The bad thing about having that as the opening is it is a long, hard slog. Genuinely, it's rough, and it's not going to really pay off until you get to the very end. So, had to go, but removing it from the start means that I've had to sort of introduce little pieces of it throughout. So, for you watching this now, that's going to be unnecessary repetition, but tough. Anyway. Now, I would abruptly shift gear into talking about the first 20 minutes. Most of my changes are in the first 20 minutes. The movie clicks into place sort of better and better as it goes. By the time you get to the end, it's basically a functional movie. Because George Lucas accidentally wasted the first episode of the trilogy and the second episode was just setting up Anakin and Padmé, he has about 20 minutes here to tell us what the middle of this story would have been like. So I maybe need to do some tiny tweaks.
This is where the fun begins.
Let them pass between us.
But for the most part, it's got a lot to accomplish, and it's doing it. With Attack of the Clones, a lot of my fixes were where action wasn't informing character, or character wasn't informing plot, or plot wasn't informing, basically just all the combinations of those three words. But it's happening here. Every moment here has importance beyond, that happened. The minimum threshold for acceptable screenwriting has been reached. There's kind of a secret and forgotten goal of movie action. I only really know about it because of a second-hand quote from Steven Spielberg, but if you look at the action in something like Indiana Jones, it has constantly escalating tension, which goes against the logic that non-stop action becomes boring, but there is a way to do it, where action informs action. You set up a problem, you resolve it, but in the process of resolving it, a new problem is created. Every time your hero overcomes an obstacle, it creates a new obstacle that puts them in a worse situation. So Obi-Wan's trying to escape these missiles, and just when you think he's dodged them, little droids fly out and start tearing apart his ship. Anakin picks some off, but accidentally shoots off his wing, changes tack to scrape them off, but one of them gets onto his ship and R2-D2 has to fight it, but that distracts Anakin from taking out the shield door. He manages to shoot it in time for Obi-Wan to make it, but the blast door starts closing and they both barely manage to crash land onto the deck. It's working. It's like Indiana Jones. Every beat is escalating into the next, which isn't an accident. George Lucas's direction to the art department when they started this scene was Temple of Doom in space. And it's even less of an accident because at the start of May 2003, none of this stuff was in the script. A week later, Steven Spielberg joins the project. His exact involvement is kept under wraps, but 2 weeks after that, all this stuff is in there. So, and most of the movie's action is working like this, which is great. You know, compared to Attack of the Clones, which was maybe able to achieve that once or twice. But actually, I lied. Obi-Wan didn't dodge the missiles. We watched them calmly fly past him in this flat, wide shot. So I've just replaced his fighter with a model from Battlefront 2 that I brought into Blender and recolored. Now, it's not a perfect match. The big thing is the detail in the model and the textures just isn't quite there. And actually, if I really wanted it to fit in, the lighting shouldn't quite look this good. They could only work with direct illumination, so there's either direct sunlight hitting the ship or just a general ambient glow. So they had to come up with a lot of clever cheats to make this look realistic. Whereas now, I can just press a checkbox that says calculate every interaction of every ray of light in the scene. Also, I animated the background behind Obi-Wan to sort of scroll away, so it gives the implication that he's starting to turn before we cut to the next shot.
Flying is for droids.
Normally, to create a clean background on a shot like this is a nightmare. Everything's moving in 3D space, but it's too subtle for automatic motion tracking to detect. And being a visual effects shot from 2005, it doesn't exactly make sense anyway. Some of these ships are stuck onto the background, some are 2D cards, some are moving independently. So instead of even trying to do it, I used an algorithm called flow edge guided video completion, which basically uses movement to guess what should fill a masked area. Now, this is a tough shot for it, so it's a little rough, but it's basically automatic instead of literally hours of work. I toyed with completely replacing some shots in the movie, and I feel like it's definitely possible to get there. I mean, that stuff's looking pretty good, but ultimately I decided my one shot tweak did enough, and I'd rather have that than some shots that maybe didn't look like they belong in the movie. But I think the exciting thing is, even if it wasn't one-to-one, the technology is there that anyone can make a shot that competes with 2005 Hollywood visual effects, you know, with free software in an afternoon. And I don't think it's a lot more work to get it to match the quality. A lot of this opening sequence is fully digital already, so if you wanted to go nuts, you could completely remake it. So anyway, that makes the buzz droids fractionally more interesting. It also helps to exaggerate the peril. You know, in a movie, you don't get out of a building before it explodes, you get out as it explodes. The missiles don't just miss Obi-Wan, he barely dodges them. Speaking of which, the hangar entry didn't look close enough to me, so let's make the door nick the top of Anakin's fighter. For the space battle, that's kind of all I'm changing. You know, it's working pretty well. It's actually a very clever sequence. George Lucas admits that he wrote himself into a corner here. For episode 1, he just wanted to introduce Anakin, and otherwise, he says he was just doing a jazz riff. Then for episode 2, he obviously had to focus on Anakin and Padmé, so when he was writing episode 3, he's quoted as saying he'd told 40% of the story and had another 80% to tell. Now those of you familiar with numbers will know that's not looking good. In its original form, the midpoint of this movie was going to be Anakin killing Dooku and turning to the dark side, with the opening half of the movie exploring the Clone War and wrapping up all those loose ends from Attack of the Clones. As it turns out, that doesn't give you enough time to explore Anakin's fall. So Dooku's death gets moved up to the beginning of the movie, and the midpoint is now killing Mace Windu and turning to the dark side, which causes problems. There now needs to be an opening action sequence that establishes the characters, the relationships, the Clone War and its effects on Anakin and the galaxy, all in the first few minutes rather than over the course of an hour. It needs to have Anakin kill Dooku, goaded into it by the Emperor, but the Emperor hasn't revealed himself yet, so it has to somehow involve the Chancellor, and it needs to introduce a replacement villain, which is a lot. It's a very elaborate puzzle, and the Chancellor's being kidnapped by a guy called General Grievous in a space battle above Coruscant is like the only reasonable answer. Now, this Count Dooku fight is probably the jankiest bit of action in the entire movie. There's some great effects work and choreography, but it just doesn't quite come together. I think because Christopher Lee wasn't even there on that day, all of his stuff was shot separately. It's all shot in a way that's optimal for a digital double or head replacement, which isn't necessarily the most optimal way for it to be any good. And there was a bit of a miscommunication on set, and George Lucas thought that these effects shots were going to be a lot easier to do than they were. So I believe it was further trimmed down in editing because of that. And if you ever wondered why the Emperor kills like 5 Jedi in 3 seconds, that's the same reason. And not because he had the most force powers or whatever you thought. The digital doubles do stick out a bit, and with a bit of a deepfake, we could definitely fix that. But I don't care. It's not the sort of thing that impacts the movie, actually. What I will do is get this to flow a little better. I'll just cut it down, spend less time on some of those close-ups. There's some stuff with the Emperor here where he's being hammy and obviously evil, which is fine, he's obviously evil. But I think it plays better to have it a bit more subtle. There's this shot that was added for continuity to hide the fact that they cut a piece out. And this is something that I found on Attack of the Clones as well, where the pickup shots act as a bridge between 2 shots. But they end up hurting the pace more than they help the continuity. So I'm just gonna rework this, and not only does it flow better, but you do not fucking notice at all. I think Anakin killing Dooku should be the most tense, jarring moment of the movie. And it basically is. But let's punch it up a little. I'll start by removing a couple of lines of dialogue here towards the end, and that adds tension. I've added a slight zoom, which is a cheap trick to make something seem a bit more dramatic, but it's used throughout the prequels, and it's used even in the shot immediately before this one, so I'm allowed. In the music, there's this little timpani build, which is great, but I think it telegraphs what's going to happen a little too obviously. You know exactly when Anakin's going to decapitate Dooku just by listening to the music, which isn't a John Williams problem, that's a mixing problem.
Kill him now.
So I'm just going to quieten it down slightly and extend it out a bit, so it's a more gradual build that suddenly crescendos, so when it actually hits, it's a little shocking. But it's interesting to note that that's one of the few times you'll see lightsabers cast light onto the actor's face, which can either be done in post with blending modes and recoloring, which pretty much never looks good, or by having an actual light on set. On The Phantom Menace, the technology just wasn't there to have a light rod that would compete with studio lighting. But by Attack of the Clones, they could, kinda. They couldn't be hit against each other, and the light was still very dim, so it was only used in a few shots in the dark in close-up, so you couldn't see the power cable and duct tape. But by the time they were shooting Revenge of the Sith, miniaturized LED tech was at the point that you could have a feasible light-up prop lightsaber. And that's not what's happening here at all. They never made that. I saw that one of these composites was credited to Mike Conte, So I asked him about it, and he had a very interesting answer, one that I don't think has ever been documented before. It was George's specific request on The Phantom Menace that the compositors not add any light from the lightsabers. And it was only after they did the practicals on Attack of the Clones that the compositors started to do it. So it's clearly something that George doesn't care about at all, and when they are doing it, it's not a director's decision, it's a compositing choice. On the one hand, yeah, it's not something that actually matters. They never cast light in the original trilogy, it's fine without it. But I think when it's there, it works to visually heighten things, and I think it actually raises the emotional stakes. Now, obviously, I've put myself in a bit of a situation here. I've just gone on a really lengthy tangent for no real reason at this point. It'll be paid off in half an hour. So I have to segue out somehow. And what I have written is, I guess I just talked about that for no reason. Now, we're going to talk about structure, and you're going to like it. Any Star Wars movie, you can map onto the hero's journey and go, oh yeah, that's the plot of the movie. And people love to do it because it always works, because they were intentionally written around that structure. But you have to really fuck up the timeline to get it to fit Revenge of the Sith. And there's a reason for that. It's not actually based on the hero's journey. It's based on ancient Greek and Shakespearean tragedy, where you have two halves with a pivot in the middle. You have mounting dread, a pivot, and then a fall to catastrophe. Now, a clever modern way to do this is where you combine tragedy structure with a bait and switch. This movie still has 3 acts. The first half of it plays out pretty traditionally, but then it hits that midpoint and goes, no, fuck you, tragedy. So one of the secret functions of this opening action sequence is it acts as a misdirect. It basically has the structure of the movie as a whole just compressed into the first 20 minutes. But what it does differently is it keeps the tone light and fun throughout. It still builds to a dark pivot in the middle, but then after that it goes back to jokey fun, to sort of tap into your subconscious and go, you know, even though this movie's obviously gonna end badly, maybe it's gonna be a fun adventure. So when we do reach that midpoint and the tone does abruptly pivot, it hits that much harder. General Grievous tells us a lot about George Lucas's direction. I want to show you a shot.
Don't bother with him! Keep the ship in orbit!
There's flat framing, it goes on too long at either end. All the classic technical problems that are throughout the prequels are here, which tells us that it's an intentional stylistic choice, because General Grievous isn't real, remember. There's not a guy who looks like that. This is a full CG character in a main role, and it doesn't seem to be a horrible accident. This is the most complex model that ILM had made up to that point. Every second he's on screen, you're watching money burn. And yet, to George Lucas, it was important to have him standing around for a full second before he says his line. So I'm leaving most of that stuff in. Even if it's technically bad, where it doesn't hurt the movie, there's no point in removing it. But of course it can hurt the movie, and often does. So that's where I get into those tiny trims. You might have noticed that I didn't deal with any of R2's action beats at the top there. I'm not really removing any of the stupid, jokey stuff. I'm not removing it. Obviously, as we now know, probably the main reason I'm not removing the stupid, jokey stuff is structural. All of that stuff that I just talked about structurally just before was in the second video, so I didn't address that here, but it is probably the main reason. So there you go, just thought I'd flag that up. People were annoyed that I didn't remove enough C-3PO from the end of Attack of the Clones, and fair enough, it's not good stuff. It's bad, actually, it's bad stuff. But in an action sequence that goes on too long, you need to have some tension breaks to let the audience reset. And it doesn't matter if the reason for that reset is laughing at a joke or going, oh, that's annoying. Either way, it pulls you out enough that you can come to the next 5-minute block of action fresh. There is, of course, the option of cutting down the action so significantly that you don't need to pull some bullshit to keep the audience invested. But I imagine, to the sort of person who's upset about 2 C-3PO jokes, 2/3 of the movie's action being cut would make you insane with hate. Now, just because it serves a logical purpose isn't really a good enough reason to leave every bad decision in. So let's see what other bullshit I can come up with. This movie has less of that stupid, jokey stuff anyway, and you need it less because the action doesn't go on that long and it's actually working. The first cut of this opening sequence was 40 minutes and it's down to 20 in the theatrical release, and a lot of what was removed was the funny, silly stuff. It's still very funny, silly, especially compared to the rest of the movie, but that's obviously the point. It opens funny, silly, so when Dooku dies, you're like, oh shit, and then it's just mounting dread as you head towards the inevitable ending. So I'll start to tone it down a bit after that point, but not completely because it still serves a larger structural purpose, which I'll have to get into next time because right now there's no way this video is going to be short enough for my taste. So R2 gets some action and some slapstick. I don't want to remove any of it, but we can punch it up. They're waiting for R2 to arrive.
R2 will be along in a few moments and he'll release the ray shields.
He starts to arrive, but then you realize he's going so fast that he hits the wall. Ha ha ha. So you have tension building to a payoff, then he shakes his head, which diffuses the tension a bit. It's not necessary. So let's instead cut to Anakin's line.
See? No problem.
Which continues the escalation of tension. Then a bunch of battle droids arrive, which pays off that. One of them points its gun at R2 and R2 shocks it. It goes, ow! And that's the big laugh of the scene. But then the battle droid kicks R2 over, which is unnecessary. It doesn't build on what came before, slightly diffuses things. But if we instead cut to Obi-Wan's line,
Do you have a plan B?
that's working. You know, that's a nice tag to the, that's like, you know, it's basically a functional scene. I think the worst offenders of the funny, silly stuff are the battle droids.
Excuse me.
In every tiny pause of dialogue, they get some stupid little lines,
You're welcome.
and it's never funny, just sort of vaguely distracting clutter. So we can drop that here, and already this works a whole lot better.
General Kenobi, we've been waiting for you. That wasn't much of a rescue. And
Then there's this little bit of banter, which right now plays.
General Grievous, you're shorter than I expected.
General Grievous seems to take genuine offense to this, even though he's obviously just sort of crouching over. It doesn't make any sense for Anakin to say that, unless he was doing irony, and General Grievous hates irony. I think the intent is that they're not taking him seriously, and General Grievous is upset about that. But right now, it definitely doesn't play that way. So let's shuffle it around a bit.
General Grievous, you're shorter than I expected.
We have a job to do, Anakin. Try not to upset him.
Jedi scum.
It plays so much better this way. I checked the script to see what the original order was, and no, it was much worse than the script. It was much worse. Now, people hate this crash landing scene, and I'm going to be real with you here. I do not get that at all. It seems fine to me. So, but let's take a look. Of course, there's a couple beats that are slightly too long, so let's tidy those up. Anakin says this thing twice in the same sentence, which is bad writing. People generally avoid saying the same phrase twice in the same phrase. It's a confusing way of constructing sentences. But I'm not going to do anything about it. It's all shot very leisurely. You know, there's no stakes to it, which I believe is intentional and working. We need to come from that opening action sequence and go into an hour of talking. So this is the bridge that de-escalates us into that. They knock over a control tower, but who gives a shit? Then Obi-Wan's line, another happy landing, gets a bit of hate for being extremely on the nose. Now, I understand there's been a bit of a breakdown of trust between the writer and the audience, but he obviously doesn't mean that literally. But I think people are identifying a problem. There is something wrong here. There's this boom in, which is a very stylistic, unconventional shot for Star Wars, and it's probably the most gratuitous shot of the digital doubles. But I don't care about that either. What I do think is that we hold on it for a little too long and cut in a little too soon. So that's all I'm changing. And it could very well fix this scene for you. I think it's very easy to underestimate the effect that a slight timing can have on your overall enjoyment. You can try this. Try adding a half-second pause before every sentence you say, and you'll notice that conversation starts to go horribly wrong. And in editing, it's very easy to add an unnatural pause. And whenever you do, you're creating a jarring effect. It doesn't happen that often in Revenge of the Sith, but I think almost every time it does happen, it's within a few seconds of a line from the movie that's become a meme. So the timing is pulling people out of the movie enough to laugh at it. Also, I'm removing this obvious pickup shot of Obi-Wan, if you wanted to know that. Now, the last time I saw Revenge of the Sith, I would have been a teenager, and I remember thinking it was tolerable. When I sat down to watch it for this, I actually found it really emotional and good, like a complete tit. The heart of this movie is Anakin and Padmé. It's about Anakin trying not to lose Padmé, and in the process, he makes a deal with the devil. That's the movie. It's a little wider than that, actually, but we're not going to get into that in this one. Just for now, it's a tragedy about Anakin and Padmé. Now, a big problem with that is if you don't care about Anakin and Padmé, the movie doesn't work. And this movie doesn't really give you any reasons to care. Though fortunately, it doesn't give you any reasons not to. I think the reason I cared when I rewatched this is because I've now spent hours of my life trying to get Anakin and Padmé to work. Now obviously that doesn't apply to you, but what it tells me is that if you are invested in Anakin and Padmé, the movie does work. So, you know, you'll just have to watch my Attack of the Clones edit. So the moment we meet them, they immediately launch into a quick recap of how their relationship is forbidden by the Jedi, which is quite clunky and it sucks, but it's here for expositional purposes. You know, that's really the key fact that we need to know about their relationship, and it's tricky because on a script level, you know, you need to tell the audience that right away, and because of the fact itself, they're the only characters who can do it. So you could remove the entire forbidden love through line, but really on Attack of the Clones I got that working to be the singular tension of their relationship, and remember, it is the heart of this movie. So another option is to just remove a couple of lines of dialogue here and create an expositional hole where there's information that the audience needs to know at the top of the movie, but we don't tell them it at the top of the movie. So that's a big problem, but it's what I'm going to do, and fortunately you probably wouldn't realize that's a problem if you didn't hear me say that, and because you did hear me say that, it's not a problem. Oh, that's annoying, isn't it? When Padmé tells Anakin she's pregnant, he has this weird negative reaction, which is again here for expositional purposes. We're being told that this puts Anakin in a tough situation, but that gets brought up later, and I think it plays a lot better to have this as subtext. I'm leaving a beat here, so there's still a little ambiguity, but if Anakin is genuinely, unconditionally happy about the baby, it actually makes it more tragic later on, and it deepens his internal conflict. Then we have one little scene of them happy together, which is great. No, I think it's fine. It's working really well, actually. It's got a job to do, and it's doing it. I'll tighten some timing. But really, after the inciting incident, I don't touch the Anakin and Padmé stuff at all. Actually, hang on. The actual inciting incident of the movie is the death of Count Dooku. That sets off a series of events that leads to the creation of Darth Vader. I'm not talking about that. You don't realize that that's the inciting incident for most of the movie. You may never realize it. Even now, you're still going, no, that's not. It is, but for the audience and for Anakin, the real inciting incident is when he has a nightmare that Padmé dies in childbirth. That sets off, you know, that's when the plot of the movie starts. But before that, we cut to General Grievous arriving on Utapau. And this is a classic scene, right? We've all seen this before. Cut to the bad guys, our evil plan is coming together, and that raises the stakes. Cool. And it's nice and subversive because the existence of General Grievous is bait. He's not real, remember. It's set up like he's going to be the villain that they fight at the end, and obviously he isn't. He just sort of dies right before the pivot. Not an accident. He dies as we leave that sort of movie and go into a tragedy. But it's only been 8 minutes since we last saw General Grievous, and we won't see him again for another half hour. All of the exposition in this scene is about stuff that will happen in at least half an hour's time. And it's just quite jarring and early for a scene like this. It was always here in the script, but I think the audience really needs that emotional hook of Anakin's nightmare before the plotting kicks in. And it ends with the Emperor going, "Soon I will have a new apprentice," which has the effect of filling whatever the following scene is with a sense of dread. Right now, that scene is Anakin and Padmé happy on the balcony, which is the one scene in the movie that we don't want any extra dread in. So let's look at where we can move this. Anakin has his nightmare, whines to Padmé, whines to Yoda. Obi-Wan tells him to go see the Emperor. The Emperor tells him he's on the Jedi Council. The Jedi go, "What the fuck? By the way, has anyone seen General Grievous?" Obi-Wan tells Anakin to spy on the Emperor. Anakin whines to Padmé. The Emperor gives us his backstory and tells Anakin where Grievous is. Anakin tells the Council, and Obi-Wan leaves to go do a fight. So I tried it between every one of those scenes. Logically, it should fit well in the beginning somewhere, but I found those first few scenes actually flow so much better without it. And if you want to have this mounting dread slowly building over the course of your movie, a good way to do that is by not blowing your load right out the gate. So I think it makes a lot of sense to put it before the Jedi Council scene in terms of pace, tone, plot, structure. You know, it all fits perfectly. Unfortunately, it ruins the Jedi Council scene and this scene and the preceding scene because it fits so perfectly, it feels ludicrously on the nose. Once we go past that point, the scene starts to change in meaning. Now, instead of the dramatic irony of knowing where Grievous is before the characters do, we're placed into the character's shoes. We get the mystery of where is General Grievous before we get the reveal. So it adds to that feeling of a hidden threat. It helps the audience to invest in the plotting, but of course that comes at the cost of some setup. Now, we could even push it as far into the movie as before or after the Darth Plagueis scene. Originally, the Emperor telling Grievous to move to Mustafar and the Emperor telling Anakin Grievous was on Utapau were random facts separated by 40 minutes that you're just going to forget about over the course of the movie. The closer we juxtapose them together, it adds a layer of what is he up to? But that's a little too late. There were really two options that I felt worked, and I have gone for the most extreme of the two. I'm putting it after Obi-Wan tells Anakin to spy on the Emperor, and before Anakin whines to Padmé. It falls right on the act break. It makes the Jedi's request seem like even more of a betrayal of trust. And now, when Anakin is complaining to Padmé, it feels emotionally justified because of this layer of dread, which all sounds great, but really it's just the place that felt the best. I think the biggest problem with Revenge of the Sith is it feels like Anakin turns too quickly. You know, he goes from, "I need to save my wife," to, "Alright, I'll kill everyone," in like a second. That's actually just set up for the Jar Jar Binks punchline, but it's a pretty good introduction to what I'm going to go into. So, there you go. You can just imagine, just come up with a little punchline yourself. Anakin's little tantrum sucks. You can see what the intent is, to show Anakin being caught in this power play between the Emperor and the Jedi, but instead it plays like him having a hissy fit. I think it really needs a rewrite just to slightly push it in the direction of the Jedi being overly suspicious and cold, exaggerate that side of it, which obviously makes Anakin have more of an internal conflict, makes us empathize with him more, and makes that tension actually apparent to the audience. If, rather than verbal conflict here, we had a building, quiet, internal conflict slowly tearing Anakin apart, not only would it help this scene, but it would help to sell the pivot. But I can't do that. They shot him throwing a sook. All the footage I have is of him throwing a sook. And obviously I can't remove it. So I've tried to lightly push it in the right direction. I'm just going to remove some dialogue and draw out the pauses to add tension. We get this punch in as he's yelling to show us that, wow, he's pissed. So I just made a janky little face replacement to keep us in the wide. And then I've just drawn out this take of Mace with a bit of a background replacement to show us that, wow, he's pissed. Now, when Anakin finds out that the Emperor is a Sith, he pulls out his lightsaber and points it at his throat. They're exaggerating the length to heighten the stakes. By having the blade so close to his throat, it makes both of them seem more dangerous. Anakin seems more unhinged because one little wrong move and he could kill a guy, and the Emperor's more unhinged because he clearly doesn't care about that. But I want to push this further. I want to have the lightsaber actually cast light onto the Emperor's face. Now, I've done a little face relighting on here before. On the Blade Runner edit, I actually got a 3D model of Harrison Ford's face and relit that. Ridiculous, and it doesn't look that good. So I had it in my mind as something that I wanted to figure out. Then I accidentally stumbled on learning physics-guided face relighting under directional light, which is pretty incredibly realistic. But the code isn't publicly available yet, so I used a much worse algorithm called deep single-image portrait relighting, which gives me a shitty box. But we've now got detail in the shadows and light coming from the right direction, and it's tracked onto the face. I was worried it would look disastrously flickery. This algorithm isn't made for video, but actually it's pretty much perfect. All I need to do is mask it and color it and blend it. It's a subtle effect, and you're probably thinking a ridiculous waste of time, but it helps to sell the proximity, which heightens the stakes, and we get a little bit of motivated uplighting out of it, which is that uncanny monster look, most famously used in holding a light under your chin. So now we're getting to Anakin's turn, and my hope is, with all of these little tweaks that I've made throughout the movie, that we're playing into this more abstract operatic style and giving the whole thing a bit more of a tonal flow. So the pivot still hits just as hard, but maybe it feels a bit more earned. Now, this section of the movie was fairly drastically reworked already. Originally, Anakin would just be hanging out here throughout the fight because he'd already made up his mind that the Emperor had a lot of good ideas, actually. As it plays now, he goes, "No, I'm going to turn you in," goes to Mace. Mace demands his trust and sends him off to cry in the temple. Then he makes his way back and kills Mace on accident, which is really great. Imagine the movie without that stuff. This is really a far superior way of doing it. Excellent tragedy stuff, but it does cause a problem. Now, instead of Anakin turning because he genuinely believes in the Emperor's plans, he's turning coincidentally because he wants to save his wife so much. So it makes a lot less sense for him to immediately go, "Alright, I'll kill all the Jedi." So that's why it's a problem. That is the problem. And George Lucas's solution was something that he pretty much came up with on the fly. While they were doing pickups, he decided to make this into like a deal with the devil. So they're modulating the Emperor's voice, brightening up his skin so he's almost glowing, and making it so it's more of a mystical thing. The pivot is like a pivot out of literal reality and into like the spiritual, which is nice. Fuck you. There's just one little piece here that I will change. We see Anakin leave the Jedi Temple before Mace arrives to arrest the Emperor. And I think it's one of those situations that we talked about last time where they're overvaluing the continuity in the pickup shot. So I'm just going to remove that piece, and halfway through the fight, we will cut back to Anakin on his way. It's definitely the tonal choice over the logical choice. Like, we see Anakin leave frame, but we don't get to see him getting in the ship. But I think as an audience, we're pretty used to not seeing every departure and arrival of every character, so I don't think it makes it any harder to follow. And the later we can push Anakin's choice, the more we play into this tonal pivot. Now, there's some changes here that I just completely cut and didn't talk about at all for time, and they're probably some pretty important ones, but I had a point that I wanted to make, and that sort of superseded this stuff. One of the things that George Lucas says is going on in this scene is that there is like some force manipulation of Anakin, and that doesn't really come across. So what I did is just added like a low rumbling throughout the scene, sort of crescendoing around key lines of the Emperor to kind of play into that a bit more. It's obviously a little trick that J.J. Abrams used on The Force Awakens when Kylo Ren was saying things sometimes, and say what you will about J.J. Abrams, but he is the master of stylistic tricks to do emotional manipulation. I tweaked the color grade a little, and I don't know if I can really show a comparison, but only just to sort of make it pop a little more and give it a bit more vibrance and contrast, so it's sort of more intense without really having any drastic difference from anything else. Now, I believe Anakin's line here was originally "Yes, my master," and in ADR, George decided to change it to "Thank you, my master." He has these changes all throughout this movie. People are often not saying the dialogue that matches the... It's a disaster. And here, it really sort of emphasizes the bad overacting. I can't fix it, but I have just sort of trimmed around this a little bit to sort of tighten it up. And I tweaked one shot of Anakin here to add a camera shake and some chromatic aberration and a slight zoom. It's kind of like taking that dream sequence effect and dialing it right back to like 2% to sort of give a slight hint at some unreality, force manipulation stuff. But I think that's all the tweaks that I've made to the scene. And if you watched it through, you probably wouldn't realize that I'd done anything at all. But I do think it's just slightly tightening the bolts. And also, while we're here, C-3PO has this really terrible line read of "I feel so helpless." And in the original trailer, he delivers it like you'd expect. It's a great moment. They used it in all of the trailers, I think, because it's such a great line. But then in ADR, clearly George decided to change it up, and it's quite bad. But the trailer mix and stuff is basically unworkable, so I can't really use that. What I did do is just sort of tighten the timing up just slightly. So I really think that's all I can change. Anything more, and you either change the meaning of the movie, or you need to do some reshoots. Which would help, actually, but it's working really well on that abstract level. And I can see how it loses people, but I don't think it missteps. I probably am in the camp that thinks the scale of the ending doesn't need to be this ridiculous, but it's not like it's unearned, you know, and we're contrasting the destruction of industry with the collapse of democracy. Symbolically, there's a lot happening here, and I don't think it needs to be trimmed down in terms of pacing. It holds up, and every beat has purpose and drive and meaning. But there's this shot of Yoda knocking over some guards, which is probably the most successful bit of slapstick in all of Star Wars, if that's something you're looking for. It involves actual stuntmen taking a fall rather than animated creatures acting wacky, so there may be some correlation there. But there's a pretty big problem. It comes immediately after the start of Obi-Wan and Anakin fighting, which is a pretty emotionally charged moment, the climax of the movie. And we go from that to the broadest joke possible. If it was one scene later, you'd keep it as a bit of a reset of the tension, but as it is, this is the emotional climax of the movie. It ruins the mood. But we can't delay it. We do need to cut there for pace, and it is the start of Yoda's action sequence, so it can't be removed either. So I've just painted out the guards out of every shot they were in. Now originally, I was going to actually explain myself there, you know. It's potentially the biggest effort change that I made on Revenge of the Sith. Just pissed away as a throwaway joke. It really is what it sounds like. You paint over a frame of the video, and then you cut those pieces out and stick them back on top. If you're lucky, the video isn't moving at all, but I was incredibly unlucky. Really, there's 3 ways that you can combine it back on top of the original footage. If the camera is just panning, it's not moving around at all, I can do a 2D track and then just stick a card on top of the footage. If the camera is moving around a bit, then I have to recreate the camera move and then have 3D cards on top of the footage. But then if the camera is really moving, like they've got a magical 3D camera and they don't give a fuck about how realistically it moves, I'm fucked. I have to recreate the geometry of the scene and then project my paint out onto that and have a 3D camera move through it. Then whenever anything passes in front of the area that I've painted out, I have to cut that out and put that back on top. But fortunately, I was able to use some computer magic to help with that. But after that, it's just pure, like, mythological themes and symbols. We're overlapping death and rebirth with the birth of the father and the death of the mother. People hate Padmé's death because they think she just gives up and dies of a broken heart, but they're wrong. First off, nowhere in the movie is that said. You know, it's not lazy writing. It would be very easy to have her choked to death by Anakin or, you know, just give the droid an explanation. Oh no, her life energies are being sucked out and it's making a Darth Vader. That's not what's happening. It's designed so you bring your own meaning to it. But to help you out, I'd say it's playing into these mythological themes. In order to create life, there has to be suffering on the part of the creator. Every generation is the death of the previous one. So while Anakin holds on and gives in to the creation of Darth Vader, Padmé chooses to give her strength to the twins. And it's ultimately her faith and trust in Anakin that echoes in Luke in Return of the Jedi.
There is good in him.
Pretty nice. And in contrast to the cold detachment of the Jedi, we end on this display of tender masculinity. And that's the hope for the future. I just realized I've worked these themes in as structural payoffs to the stuff I was talking about at the beginning. But if that didn't work for you in Revenge of the Sith, it won't work for you here either. I've done nothing to convince you. Freaking waste of time. And yeah, Darth Vader is pathetic. But if anything, that's the point of the prequels. And anyway, what did you want? Him to prance around killing people with a lightsaber? Oh dear. Now, that was not meant to be the ending. The ending was going to be this, which I ended up wasting on the first episode. My goal is not to drastically change anything. I am trying to get the most impact out of the smallest tweaks. I would rather leave in something that's a little borderline than have a gap where something should have been. So that's it for this one. I've probably been a little light on my changes for a lot of you, but I think it's really, really close to working. And it's maybe not everything you want it to be, but it is everything it's trying to be.